yeah, we could always, okay.
All right.
So Professor Bryant, I have to tell you, I have been reading the Yoga Sutras book, and it's so helpful. It has helped me clarify many of my thoughts.
Oh, well, thank you. I did nothing other than sort of channel the voices of the commentators. That's the trick.
No, but the distilling is
yeah,
very helpful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think we'll get started, Professor, yes?
Yes, absolutely. We'll dive in, okay. So,
well, let me introduce you and welcome everyone to this.
Remember the sutra introduction, huh?
Yes, sir.
6 words, only 6 words. The average length of the Yoga Sutra, average size is 6 words.
Sutrakara Vakya. Okay, right. So thank you, everyone. This is UMass Dartmouth's Indic Studies program. A special presentation. We have a guest lecturer today in our class called The Science of Kriya Yoga. This is a class we've been studying the idea of what yoga is from the perspective of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, but also the idea of what science is from a general Western epistemic perspective, and discussing how these two things intersect. Today, we are really grateful and honored to have, I think, one of the great still very young scholars of the yoga tradition and many different types of Hindu dharmic traditions, Professor Edwin Bryant, who studied at Columbia University, taught at Harvard University, teaches currently at Rutgers University, and really has written several books, many articles, but fundamentally a seminal edition of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali's, which will begin his discussion today with us. And without any further ado, I'd just like to thank Bela Gupta ji, Professor Sukalyan Sen Gupta, Professor Balaram Singh, all of our friends from IST 111 Science of Kriya Yoga class. If you could turn your cameras on, it's always nice, guys, to interact with the speakers. And welcome everyone here to UMass Dartmouth Indic Studies guest lecture series. Professor Bryant, thank you. Welcome. Namaste.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to spend a few minutes with you all, reading some Shastra. And it's a pleasure to be in the Association of Great Dignitaries. So we'll dive straight in. Why don't we see how it goes? We'll see what everyone's interests are. My initial idea was to maybe connect the Ishvara of Patanjali with Ishvara of the Bhagavata Purana, but that may not be everybody's interest, given that your course is on Kriya Yoga and sort of interface with modern science, which is, I'm so gratified to, it's always been my secret hope that, given that we can't essentialize, but given that Indian scholars are so well represented in the sciences, it's always been my hope that there would be more, that it would be inevitable that there will be dialogue between the Vedanta, the Sankhya, the ancient Indian traditions, and modern physics. Indian intellectuals have always, over the centuries, engaged opposing points of view or adjacent points of view, the entire commentarial tradition on any a sutra text. I think most of you know a sutra really is a kind of a cryptic way of preserving information. The sutra tradition emerges in the late Vedic period, and there seems to have been a sort of a, maybe a threat from Buddhism that was emerging and perhaps challenging some of the fundamental truths of the Vedika traditions. Although we actually had a lecture in Rutgers just 2 weeks ago, Joseph Walser, who was actually questioning that the Buddhists, we assume that the Buddhists are generically anatmavadins, And he was questioning that whole premise. He was saying that you know, there may have been certain voices that took a strong stance on the Buddhist position of anatman, no atman, whereas actually there were many Atmavadins, there were many Brahmins who were Buddhists, and he basically looks at the early text. Anyway, that's a story for another day. But so the sutra tradition emerges. Perhaps there's the sense of a need to systematize the old Upanishadic teachings, which are not systematic. They're beautiful, but they're very metaphoric, and you know, different things are expressed in different places, and because of that variegatedness, you know, you have so many different Vedanta sects that emerge and prioritize different possibilities of the Upanishad. So you get this Sutraic tradition, and so today we're going to look at the Yoga Sutras, one of the a number of sutra traditions, which takes essentially a couple of passages, one from the Katha Upanishad, one from the Shvetashvatara. We have some Sanskritists here. I have to be a little bit more careful here about pronunciation. A couple of passages that overall, one of the primary themes of the Upanishads is to seek the self. So we get these repeatedly through the Upanishads, that it is the self that is to be sought, that all things are dear. They're only dear, you know, children and wives and so forth. They're only dear because they give satisfaction to the self. So really it's the self that should be sought. So we have this overall kind of thrust in the Upanishads that the real purpose of life is to seek this self, but not much of a method in terms of how to go about doing this. And of course, you know, Dvaita Vedanta just takes that in one direction. Dvaita Vedanta takes just the contemplation of the teachings, the Shravana, the hearing the teachings, and Manana, contemplating them, and Nididhyasana, Manana, you know, applying logic to them, and then Nididhyasana, you know, absorbing the mind in them. It takes that as a process. But a couple of passages in the Upanishads, we get a slightly overlapping, but a different sort of process, rather than contemplating the teaching. Not that that's rejected, but we get this sense of actually fixing the mind completely. So contemplation, svadhyaya, your course is called Kriya Yoga. So the second chapter of Patanjali is actually Kriya. The Kriya, it's Kriya Yoga. And the second item of the first sutra is Tapaha Svadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhana. So the Svadhyaya, which is the studying and contemplating and all that good stuff that Vedanta does. But that's secondary in yoga. That's preliminary. That's sort of, you know, convinces one that there is an Atman, and purifies the mind. Just contemplated the sacred text purifies the mind, is considered to be to create a state of sattva or shuddha. But yoga is distinctive in that it prioritizes a practice of ultimate practice of absolute and utter stilling of the mind, not contemplating truths, and that's where it parts company with Advaita Vedanta, where there is a sort of, you know, more of a contemplating the great Mahavakyas, the great statements, teachings of the Upanishads, and then at some point there's a eureka moment where those theoretical teachings all of a sudden transfer. All of these traditions have a eureka moment, which is a fascinating topic unto itself, as one of our students from Rutgers is looking at that now for a PhD. What's this eureka moment from a mental state to an actual experiential state? But let's push that aside. So we have this method that we first see clearly in the Katha, just a few lines there, and the Shvetashvatara, about a method for actually stilling the mind completely. So that method, which we also see in earlier texts, because Patanjali says Atta Yoga Anushasanam, he's continuing old teachings, he's not laying claim to anything new. So we see these old teachings, the Anu, is continuing from the Upanishads, from the Mahabharata, the Moksha Dharma, a text that has really needs a few PhD dissertations right there in the Moksha Dharma. of the Mahabharata. So we see this method involving an absolute stilling of the mind. And Patanjali calls it Nirodha. And therefore he defines it as Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So when the mind is absolutely stilled, 100%, Tada Kim Bhavati, then the third sutra, Drashtu Swarupe Vasthanam. Then the seer, Patanjali likes this term seer. Elsewhere, he also uses the term Atman. You've run into the term Atman. You've run into, you're familiar with the term Purusha, Atman. Both of those are in the sutras. But this idea of the seer, because it's an Atman is just a vague term. It doesn't really give you much information. Neither does Purusha. Whereas when you use the language of a seer, then you're giving a richer sense that this is a state of experience. Of not eyeball seeing, obviously, like the Upanishads say, it's the seer behind seeing. So the goal of this type of yoga, this absolute stilling of the mind yoga, right? Yogash, chitta, vritti, the turmoils, the fluctuations of thought, nirodha, tada, then what? Prashtu svarupa, svarupe vasthanam. Then there is literally the situatedness. We don't say that in English, but you get the sense if that's what the word means. The situatedness, we would have to say something like the being situated, drashtuhu, of the seer, swarupa, swarupe, in its own nature, its own essence. And so the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is, I've been asked to say something about that, is the method. It is a method that's outlined by Patanjali to a process, the goal of which, there's not so much of a philosophy, really. The Yoga Sutras presupposes the metaphysics of Sankhya. So anyone, nowadays we read the Yoga Sutras as an isolated text because it's sort of become the canonical text for Main Street Yoga, right? The great teachers of the asana, which is the yoga that you encounter in the high street. Those Krishna coming from Krishnamacharya and his disciples and Shivananda and his disciples, that asana tradition. So, Krishnamacharya and Guruji Iyengar, they were traditionalists. If you're a traditional Vaidika thinker, you can't make stuff up. You can't just come up, you can't just sit under a tree and come out and express some new truth. You have to situate your truth somehow or other. You have to connect it with pre-existing truths that are expressed in the canonical texts. So these thinkers then, these great teachers of yoga, Krishnamacharya, Iyengar, to some extent Shivananda, they sort of plucked up the Yoga Sutra text as a canonical text for asana. And so therefore that's become a very, we've become familiar with the Yoga Sutras. If you do a teacher training course, you have to have, whatever it is, 200 hours teacher training asana, you have to have 20 hours philosophy. That philosophy is going to be the philosophy of the Yoga Sutra. So now, due to these quirks of fate, if you will, wonderful quirks of fate, here it is, a certain thing called yogas in our high streets and main streets, and the Hindu text, the canonical text that has become associated with it is the Yoga Sutras. So people are reading these Yoga Sutras, but if you're reading this in pre-modern India, essentially it's Sankhya. The metaphysics, the philosophy is Sankhya. And Vyas, the commentator, when he finishes his commentary, says, and thus ends the chapter on Sankhya. But anyway, I'm getting away from myself. So what is this yoga? It's stilling the mind completely. That's the definition of classical yoga. Okay, so unless we stick another term in front of it, like Kriya Yoga, or Karma Yoga, or Bhakti Yoga, when we use the term yoga, meaning when you see that term used in the Mahabharata, in the Puranas, in the larger kind of literary universe of ancient India, when the term yoga is used, and the practitioner of yoga is the yogi, when we see those two terms used, it's in the context of a fairly austere practice, often situated in the forests of ancient India. It's where the yogis are. Even, you know, Ramchandra, when he's in the forest, the yogis there. The Pandavas forest, yogis are there. So there's often associated even the Shvetashvatara, Shvetasvatara. You know, there's a sense of a nook, a cranny, a cave. So an isolated place. Why isolated place? Because you're chittavritti narodha. You have to still the mind completely. How are you going to do that? You're not going to do that sitting in the middle of the Jersey Turnpike. So you go to a place that's most favorable to do that. Just like if you're a skier, what do? You don't go to the Sahara Desert. You go somewhere where there's snow. So if you're trying to completely still your mind, so you go to the place that's most conducive to that. That in ancient India, that was the forest. For early Christians, that would have been the desert. Early Indians, that was the forest. So we have this practice. Even the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, which gives a different definition of yoga. Samatvam yoga muchyate karma sukoshalam. Gita wants to prioritize action. So it defines yoga as skill in action, how to act without desire, so as to be free of results, and so forth. Even the Gita says, well, actually, there were two types of yoga. One got lost. Karma yoga got lost. Krishna says in the 4th chapter. So even the Gita acknowledges that at that time, the yoga that was in extant, it was Patanjalian type stilling of the mind yoga. Krishna says, yoga nashta, it became lost. And then he says, and Arjuna, I'm coming to reestablish that old yoga that in the beginning, I gave it to Vivishwan, right? Evam parampara, Vivishwan, Manu, like that. So even the Gita, which wants to give a new definition of yoga, is actually saying, well, there were two types, and the one that still survived is the stilling of the mind yoga, but there was this other action yoga, got lost. Arjuna, I'm choosing you, and I'm going to reestablish that action yoga. So all of which is to say that when we hear the term yoga and the practitioner, the yogi, it means this Patanjali, what I'm calling Patanjalian type yoga. You could call it classical yoga. You could call it Chittavritti Nirodha yoga, anything you want. Dhyana, actually the old texts call it dhyana yoga. Mostly it's called dhyana. So this yoga then is, it involves the complete and utter. It's not contemplate, and don't get it confused with mindfulness, my friends. Mindfulness is another very rich practice, but it's coming out of Buddhism. Early Buddhism had two types of practices. One was the Chittavritti Nirodha practice, and also this mindfulness also emerges in Buddhism, which is not a stilling of the mind, but more of a sort of observing the mind. But classical yoga then is a Chittavritti, okay, Chitta is the mind. And to just look forwards, you can easily learn it. Maybe we can convince Professor Reddy to put it on your midterm exam or your final exam. What is the classical definition of yoga? Well, here it is. Yogash. Why is it yogash? It's yogaha, but it's followed by a cha. So yogash chitta, double T, not single T. That's a completely different thing. Yogash chitta. Vritti is so chitta is the mind. And vritti are the permutations. Vrit means to turn in Sanskrit. So yoga is the nirodha, nirodhana. It's the nirodha. Nirod in Sanskrit means to stop. It's the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. And then tada, and then if you do that, then what? Tada drashtu sarupe vastanam. Then there is a swarupa vastanam experience. There's an experience of the seer, meaning Atman. It's just another term for Atman, but Atman's just a word. Purush is just a word, whereas the drashtra is a richer word because it gives it information. It's actually the source of experience. It's the ultimate experiencer. Shankara says you don't need to argue for an Atman. Everybody knows they have an Atman because everybody experiences. What do you need to? What pramana do you need for that? What proof do you need for that? Are you not experiencing? Well, there's your pramana right there. There's your proof right there. So it's the ultimate. The ultimate source of your experience of qualia. So that's and so yoga is a dualistic system. It's important to understand this. So it's dualistic. And what do I mean by that? That this seer is distinct from the seen. So just like Platonic dualism or Christian dualism, you know, the soul and matter. We should be careful though. We shouldn't be using maybe initially just to sort of one time to make a correspondence, but we should be careful about using employing language that comes from Western theology and Western philosophy, because it brings its own associations and baggage, which is not necessarily relevant to yoga. And here's an example of that. If you want to use the term soul, well, hang on a second, because what is the soul? In Christianity, basically Christianity is basically Plato Christianized by Augustine and by Aquinas and Augustine. So the Platonic soul is let's just bring in, before I finish that sentence, we'll bring in the language, modern language of philosophy and religion. This would be called substance dualism. That there is a substance underpinning certain qualities that's different from all known empirically perceivable material substances. Now, whether those substances are atoms or protons or electrons, or keep going, muons and gluons or string, or you keep going ad infinitum, there is something distinct from that. So if you're looking for the source of consciousness in some neuron or combination of neurons, the yogis would say, good luck with it. We'll check back in 50 years and see how you're doing, because it isn't a material entity. So therefore, what is it then? It is a substance. It stands below certain qualities. And what are those qualities? Now here, there's a distinction between let me not be generalized there, yogic dualism and Platonic Christian dualism. Because Plato would say, agree with all of that, and would say that these qualities, the substance, the underpinning, these distinct substance underpins consciousness, yes, agrees with yoga, but also thinking and feeling and willing and the mind and these other psychic qualities. And that's why we have to be careful about using the word soul, because in yogic dualism, they would agree with Plato that yes, this substance underpins consciousness, but doesn't underpin these other qualities of thinking and feeling and willing. Those qualities are actually material, and they belong to a covering of consciousness called the chitta. In this verse that is going to be on your final exam, you might as well get used to it. Yogas, chitta, vritti, nirodha. The chitta has these qualities of thinking and intellectuality and emotionality. All of those are different aspects of the chitta. And so therefore it's a more radical dualism. The yogis would probably have said to Plato, you've got to keep going, my friend. You know, you've got to keep growing if you're looking for the ultimate source of being. You got stuck halfway on the mental level. You got to keep going to that which lies beyond the mind, because if after all, if thinking was a quality of the Atman, how could you nirodha it? Yeah, think about the sun. The qualities of the sun are heat and light. You can't nirodha the heat and light of the sun. It's where, as long as there's a sun, its qualities are coextensive with it, coexistent with it. How can you nirodha them? So in the same way, the very notion of nirodha of the chitta implies that it can't be absolutely fundamental to the seer. And in fact, later on in chapter 3, Patanjali says, yes, the mind is internal compared to the world out there, but it's actually external. It's internal, right? It seems to be in our head. The mind, thoughts are in our head, but it's actually external from the point of view of consciousness itself. And therefore, one can nirodha the mind, because it's an external. And what does it mean to nirodha the mind? The vrittis, the thoughts, the feelings, any activity whatsoever in the practice of yoga has to be nirodha. for that ultimate experience of the Swarupa, the actual true nature, Sva, its own nature. Because Sutra number 4, if it's not Swarupa, it's not in its own nature, then what's consciousness doing? Then Vritti Sarupyam, then it's absorbed in some other nature, the nature of the mind. The mind isn't us any more than this shirt is me. So this is classical yoga, my friends, and of the the Yoga Sutras then emerges from the late Vedic period in order to, as all the sutras do, the sutras emerge to clarify essentially the teachings of the Upanishads, and in the case of Mimamsa, the older Vedas. This need emerges, perhaps it's a thread of Buddhism, perhaps it's, if you read the traditional sources, there's actually a sense that it's a Kali Yuga, the ages are changing. The age of Kali, you've all heard of the 4 ages, the Greeks had similar ideas. So in the beginning of the Mahabharata and the beginning of some of the Puranas, there's a sense that the Kali Yuga is arriving and people will lose their ability to, memory is going to fail. People become weak in body and mind, and maybe the cheating propensities increase. And so therefore, there was a need by what we might call intellectuals, the tradition calls the sages, the rishis of the time, Vyas and his disciples, to preserve and fossilize. And you get these sages, Badarayana, Patanjali, emerging and writing these sutras. In one sense, they were successful. Because here we are in the 21st century, reading right here all over the main street or high streets of all over the West, but not just the West, slowly spreading in other countries, Japan and so forth. Somehow we're doing this thing called yoga, which is heavily embroiled in asana, which actually only has 3 sutras. It only has 12 words on asana, which means the poses out of 1,200. So exactly 1% of the text is actually poses. But nonetheless, along with that, we're doing a course at Rutgers called Western Encounter with Hinduism. Just this week, I went for a bike ride this afternoon, and I was preparing for class. And we're reading the chapter on how Hinduism is affecting the West, unknown to everybody. Unknown to everybody. Right? If you think about how other religions have spread historically, we think of conversion. We think of sort of there's a sort of cognitive moment when you recite a creed or a statement of creed. A creed means what you believe in, credo, right? So, or there's some kind of a baptism or a sort of a formal moment, a symbolic moment, and then there's this change from a previous way of thinking to a sort of new religious way of thinking. And that's how we think of, that's what history has shown us to be the case with our, Abrahamic sort of Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism too. That's not what's happening with Indian philosophy. These ideas, and I was just reading, so I've got the figures right at my fingertips. I thought I had, hang on. I think it is 35% of Americans now believe in reincarnation. Where is that coming from, my friends? It's not coming from Plato. Plato believed in reincarnation. Plotinus believed in reincarnation. Don't tell me 35% of Americans are reading Plato and Plotinus. These ideas are kind of piggybacking along with this sort of subtle spread of ideas that we can associate, generally speaking, with what we now call Hinduism. Vegetarianism, where's that coming from? The idea of consciousness, right? So they're not religious language, but the idea that there's some kind of deep level consciousness. These ideas are permeating our Western, the Western world, and just since the 60s. So in this way, yoga philosophy, subtly, and aspects of it are, and meditation now is becoming, CNN, there's programs on even what's his name, Anderson Cooper, meditates every day and sort of likes to talk about it. So these ideas then are slowly permeating our Western landscape without anybody thinking that they are in any way converting or becoming Hindus or anything like that. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, I think, that we'll see increasing in the decades ahead. So anyway, so back to Patanjali. So Patanjali then gives us his goal. That this is, I think we'll just, we'll skip the, I was going to read some Bhagavata Purana only because I love Bhagavata Purana, but if you want me to give a talk, just say, okay, you can read some Bhagavata at the end, then I'm happy to give a talk. But let's skip that. I hope nobody feels that, how about we leave that for another time? God stealing butter. How about we have an official little, some other time we can talk about that. Let's stick with yoga. Also because I want to make a connection with Kriya Yoga, because that's the name, that's the course you're doing. So we know what the goal is. It is Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the stilling of any movement at all whatsoever, any thinking, anything at all, absolute and utter, by sheer willpower, partly, could be by sheer willpower, but we'll get to another option in a minute. And as a result of, if one can achieve that this stilling of the mind, and so that's what meditation is. Okay, even though mindfulness has become very popular, perhaps people think it's easier, it probably is easier. But actually Indian and early Buddhist, especially Theravada Buddhist meditation is not mindfulness. It's actually the same thing, fixing the mind. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And what do you get from that? Tada, takim bhavati, then what? So, okay, I still my mind, then what? Drashtu sarupe vasanam. The traditions claim, same as the Gita, all of these traditions. Gita, same. In the Gita, Krishna says some perceive it, some hear about it, some talk about it. So the goal of these traditions is not some belief, some, okay, if I sign this predal contract and then I'll end up in some next life, I'll end up in some nice place. Not like that. But that in this very life, that one can achieve this, attain this. It's not something for ancient Indians or right, because consciousness is consciousness. What's that got to do with geography or birth, right? In fact, Patanjali says in chapter 2, Jati Desha Kala Samayana Vichinnaha. I got nothing to do with it. Your country, your geography, the time of you live in. What's that got to do with consciousness and the mind? Right? Every creature is conscious. Every living creature is conscious. What to speak of humans, and we have minds. So therefore, these teachings are not really. Why are they Indian? Why are they? They are. Patanjali doesn't say anything about Indian. They are universally applicable. So here we have now. Here it is. Yoga. Well, since Vivekananda came 100 years ago, but really since the 60s, when there was changes in immigration law, we had these great teachers coming from India, and now yoga is here. And along with yoga slowly are coming these ideas, even if only 10% of people doing postural, what academics would call modern postural yoga. We would sort of be a little bit, we're a little uncomfortable with using the term yoga because where yoga means chitta vritti nirodha, but it's too late, it's out there, good luck getting it back. Okay, it's out there. So at least we try to sort of say, well, okay, yoga, let's just add a few, let's call it modern postural yoga. And that way we make it a little bit clear about how we understand what's going on the high street. It's modern because this emphasis on posture is, well, is it modern? Probably actually was going on across the centuries in pre-modern India, but there was no textual tradition. It wasn't considered really something that needed the dignity of a textual tradition. You find a few verses in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and a couple of texts like that, which get plucked out of obscurity actually by Krishnamacharya and the great teachers, just to give a little bit of authority to the poses. So you get these texts that nobody ever heard of in India, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, right? The Garanda Samhita get plucked out of nowhere because they speak a little bit more about these poses. But so we have this, so there we have yoga, and the goal of which is really the stilling of the mind, not, you know, in order to create the conditions for an actual experience of this innermost deep level ultimate self that does not change, and that and anything other than that self is a covering of the self. The body is a covering. Well, that, any religion will tell you that, but I think where yoga goes a step further than pretty much any tradition is to say, well, not only is the body a covering, but the mind is too. And so therefore, by stilling that mind, one can have this experience, which is what the yogis seek. Okay, obviously there's faith involved. You wouldn't go to the forest in Chitta Vritti Nirodha unless you had some faith and you were convinced in the teachings of the Upanishads that there is an Atman. So clearly there has to be preliminary faith, but the goal of it isn't just to sort of linger in a state of faith until you die and hope for the best. The goal is to actually use that faith as an impetus to take up the practice, which will then give an experience of pure consciousness. So let's get round to connecting some of this with your with an eye on the clock up there, with your course. So having established the goal in the first chapter, Patanjali, basically the chapter is called Samadhi Pada, because Chitta Vritti Nirodha has different kinds of intensities, and they're called Samadhi states. So Samadhi, Chitta, and Nirodha is the same thing. So he talks about some of these states, which we don't need to, you know, are a little esoteric, and we don't have time to really engage them. But let's say that, so in the beginning, establishes what the goal. Patanjali says, Anu, he's continuing with the old teachings, he's not presenting anything new, they're Anu Shasanam. And in the second chapter, then he presents his Kriya Yoga. So let's maybe see if we can make, I don't know what material you've covered in your course. Kriya Yoga obviously means something in the Siddha traditions, in the Shakta traditions. You know, there's I don't know what material you've covered, but I'm here to say something about Kriya Yoga in the context of Patanjali, of the Yoga Sutras. So it just means action. Kriya means action, action yoga. It's not that common a word, actually. It might be in the Tantra, in the Shakta traditions, but you don't see that term so often in Vedanta and these sort of the Upanishadic derived traditions. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So if we want to, let's say one is convinced by this, inspired by this idea that one can have an actual in this life experience of pure consciousness, but how does one go about it? You can't just, let's say, okay, I accept it, sounds good, sounds coherent. That doesn't suddenly translate into an experience. One has to, the mind is, from an Indian point of view, we've had anadi janma, we've had infinite past births. And in each one of those, the mind has been vrittying. Why do we think now all of a sudden we decide, oh, we read a little Patanjali and say, oh, that's it, that's not interesting, I like that. Why do we think the mind is just going to nirodha magically? Of course it's not. It needs to be trained. So the first word, the second chapter is about, well, okay, let's say we're interested in the first chapter, we're interested in this experience. What do we do? What kriya, what can be done? Kriya is from kra, to act, to do. So what can we do about it? And the very first word is tapaha, which means we have to, so the whole purpose of the second chapter is we need to change the nature of the mind. And if you've studied the gunas, the Sankhya gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, I would like to hope you have. Can we get a thumbs up there? I have your students? Great. So I don't need to explain them. So for the mind to be still, for the mind to be in a state of nirodha, it has to be sattvic, 100% sattvic. And that which disturbs the mind is rajas. Tamas too. Tamas makes it lethargic, but rajas is really the disturber of the mind. And rajas manifests especially in the form of raga. It comes from the same Sanskrit root, raj. And raga is desire. There's no yoga without controlling the desires, my friends. Any kind of moksha, anything, Buddhist, anything, except possibly left-handed tantra, and even that's misunderstood. Even that actually, desires are actually structured and controlled in certain sorts of ways. So the first very word is you want to be a yogi, tapaha. We have to, tapaha means to control the senses, tap, to control the senses. Why we control the senses? Because the senses are engaged with sense objects and experience the sense objects. Those experiences are recorded in the mind in the form of samskaras. Those minds are pleasant or unpleasant, sukha dukkha. They leave an imprint. And if they're present, then they reappear the next day as a desire. Desire is simply a memory that's pleasant. And so these memories then of pleasant past experiences drive us to try to re-experience them. And of course, then by, as we, and if that's our drive, and then we act to try to re-experience these pleasurable things, then the law of karma kicks in. The law of causation, universal principle of causation, action, reaction. Don't think this karma is a Hindu belief, a belief of Hindus and Buddhists. It's a philosophical principle of cause and effect. Everything is governed by cause and effect. Maybe even quantum theory will end up. Many of the theories trying to explain the anomalies of quantum mechanics want to hang on to the old principle of cause and effect. Many world theories and so on. I think Professor Sengupta will be much better informed than I about them. So, but anyway, everything is cause and effect. Everything, weather, right? So why should, and that's how you make an inference. You make an inference where you see a connection between an effect and a cause, and there's always that connection, right? Wherever there's smoke, there's fire, and that's always the case. So that wherever there are effects, there are causes, and wherever there are causes, there are effects. So why should human behavior be just suddenly randomly an exception to that universal principle? And so for the ancient Indian thinker, why human behavior is causal and it produces effect. Why is that a religious belief? That's a logical inference. In Sanskrit, that's called anumana. And that's the basis of philosophy. So, and science. So therefore, this idea that if we act if we act, that generates an effect. Now, and what prompts action? It's desire. When we act because we have a desire or an aversion, we want to avoid something or we want to attain something, that just focus on desire. The whole second chapter of Gita, third chapter of Gita, it's all about give up desire, give up desire. Why? Because one wants to stop the reaction. Because reincarnation is nothing other than reaction. Again, we're acting till the moment of death. So when are we going to get the reactions? Some Patanjali says, drishta janma vedaniya. Some may come in this birth, but most won't, because we'll be acting. And even when reactions come, what do we do when a reaction comes? We re-react to it. So then we planted a second generation seed, and that produces a re-reaction. And in this way, it's a vicious cycle, which the ancient Indians called the ocean. What metaphor best captures the sense of endless, infinite, infinity, vast expanse? So the ocean of birth of reactions is the ocean of birth and death. So so we want to. So let's not go too far in that direction. But all of this is to say that we want to change the nature of the mind from a desire rajasic mind. Let's not even bother talking about tamasic, because it's fairly obvious that's not very desirable for yoga. But from a rajasic, and remember, rajasic means desire-laden mind, that is constantly we're thinking about desires and so forth. So the idea is, how do we change that? It's no magic. There's no magic in yoga. So maybe you're doing Kriyapada, Shaktipada traditions in your course, and the guru gives a Shaktipada. Well, even that, what's that? That's a momentary. That's just sort of a little bit of a head. That's a little bit of a head start. You get a little Shaktipada, And so that sort of triggers things, and it gives you an experience, and you realize there's something, there's truth into it, but you have to do the work. There's no magic, or even Shaktipat. It's not magic. It's just a little bit of Shakti that gives you a little kickstart. So therefore, there is work to be done in real yoga, and that work is tapas. And tapas means the control of the senses, which is completely, in a sense, alien to our kind of modern consumer type of way of thinking. So tapas then, and the result of tapas is vairagya, a state of mind which is vai without raga. Vairagya, that's in the beginning of Patanjali. That's what do you get with, that's a state of mind. So that state of vairagya is a state of vai without raga, which we could also, which we can say is a state without rajas. That's what we want. We want a state without rajas. And of course, something has to. The mind is made of. It's a metaphysical thing. So if you're changing one potential within it, it's not like a black hole. Then the other potential emerges. Again, we're bracketing tamas, and that's sattva. And so therefore, the Kriya Yoga of Patanjali are practices. He starts off with tapaha, svadhyaya, ishvara pranidhana. We'll get to them in a minute. But Kriya Yoga are practices that basically, you can say, create a state of sattva. Later on in the chapter, the same Kriya Yoga gets elaborated, and it's called Ashtanga. You may have heard the term Ashtanga. The 8 limbs. We see the same ingredients of Kriya Yoga, but in a larger context. And what's the point of the Ashtanga? What's the point of this 8-limbed yoga? Yog Anga Anushtanad, Ashudikshaye, you're purifying the mind. When we say purifying, be clear, we're talking about changing its rajasic, the desires. We're deconstructing the desires. We're burning the desires, as Krishna says in the Gita, with the fire of knowledge. When you apply knowledge to the desires, you see how ridiculous they are. You realize they're never satisfied. They're temporary. How can they satisfy if they're temporary? Even if you think they did satisfy, well, how long do they satisfy for? A moment. So when you start applying the knowledge to these desires, so they get burnt, actually, to use the language of the Gita. So what happens when we practice these limbs of yoga a little bit later on in the second chapter? Yoganga Anushtanat Ashudikshaye, Jnana Diptir, light of knowledge, Aviveka. We get this, the mind changes. It changes. It's no longer book knowledge. It's actual viveka. One perceives reality differently. The mind becomes sattvic. And when the mind becomes sattvic, what we perceive reality differently. There's nothing astonishing about that. We know that, if you take intoxication, you perceive reality differently. So the mind can perceive reality in many different ways, depending on how it's manipulated. So therefore, yoga wants to manipulate the mind, if we want to, although that sounds a bit sinister, but it wants to harness the potential of the mind, the higher potential. Why is it higher? Because it leads to a higher truth. And what's the higher truth? It's the seer itself, the ultimate sort of entity that we are on a deep level, the deep level self. So Kriya Yoga then, okay. I know I'm sort of going all over the place here, but I'm trying to pack as much as I can in a few minutes. So the goal, so Kriya, to make a link with your course in Patanjali, because it will mean different things. I'm sure you're seeing the term used. I didn't realize your course was Kriya Yoga till 5 minutes before I came on today at 5, and then I saw the Kriya Yoga. I saw the title of the course, so I'm scrambling to make this connection. So the Kriya Yoga, then the Kriya, the actions in Patanjali, and they include yamas and niyamas, certain principles designed to sort of curb our desires. Two things are going on really. On the one hand, there's willpower to curb it, that's tapas. But on the other hand, we can also change the mind by svadhyaya. This is Kriya Yoga is defined in the first verse. Kriya Yoga has 3 ingredients. Tapaha, which is control. Okay, so you're controlling the mind, the desires are arising, control, 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 fine. But then what? You want to change the nature of the mind. Well, how do you change? There's no magic. So just as desires came in from the outside, we experience sense objects, and those experiences then sit in the mind as desires, right? We had a Ben and Jerry ice cream. It was tasty, right? So the sense contacted the sense object, right? Tongue contacts the ice cream. Nice experience gets recorded as a memory, but it's a memory with good pleasant associations. That's how it's different from any other memory. So as these desires come in from the outside, and the more ragas, the more desires we have in the mind, the more the mind becomes raga full of ragas. And another word for that is rajasic. It becomes rajasic, which simply means full of desires. So on the one hand, okay, we want to sort of push that, control that, still that, but what are we going to replace it with? We can't have a black hole up there. So we want to import sattvic samskaras. And where do we get those from? The second thing on the list of Kriya Yoga, Svadhyaya, the study of the sacred texts. We immerse our minds in the wisdom teachings, to use a popular phrase, Svadhyaya, of the moksha traditions, of Vedanta, of Sankhya, of yoga. We absorb our minds in those teachings. For me, it's my canonical text, meaning the text that I get the most spiritual nourishment from, as the Bhagavata Purana. It's a bhakti text. But whatever it is, these samskaras are also going in, and they're also sitting in the mind. So you see what's happening. On the one hand, tapas, we're controlling the ragas. And on the other hand, we're importing lots of study. Ishvara Pranidhana is the third thing on that list. 3 things in Kriya Yoga, just sutra number 1 of Kriya Yoga. All right. Chapter 1, we get yoga. Yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. Fine. Chapter 2, we get, okay, that's the goal, but we have the kriya. We have to do some stuff if we want to chitta vritti nirodha from chapter 1. So kriya, what are we going to do? How do we prepare the mind? How do we transform it? So it stands a chance of actually nirodha-ing, of being nirodhitaha. How do we change the nature of the mind? Have you tried to sit down and meditate, my friends? Do it. Just do a secular little experiment. You go to your dorm rooms or whatever, sit and get a mantra. Most Hindu meditation is mantra, including Patanjali. If you don't like, if that sounds too religious for you, then to fix your mind on it. Patanjali says, Yatabi Mata, he's not dogmatic. Fix it on anything you want. But try fixing it and see how difficult it is. Just so you get some respect, just so you get a sense of it's not just theoretical. Just go to your dorm room, close the door when your roommates are not around. Sit and see if you can fix your mind. Mantra on your breath. See if you actually still your mind. I'll give you $10. I'll give you $10 if you can do it for more than 2 minutes. That's how hard it is. And so therefore, why? Because our minds are so completely rajasic, the most of us. So therefore therefore kriya, there needs to be work to change the nature of that mind, right? And that's partly the society we live in, the goals that our consumer culture instills in us. It's not a bad, I'm not, judging. It's just we are products of our, we're born in a particular time. So therefore, kriya, there needs to be work. So on the one hand, right, tapaha, we're stilling the mind, but then we also need to import these sattvic samskaras, and we get that from the other 2 things on the list. Svadhyaya, study of the sacred texts. You're getting some of that in your course with Professor Reddy. And thirdly, this is a theistic tradition, that there is an Ishvara, that there is a supreme being, an intelligent being, what modern scientists, if they might call intelligent design, perhaps. That's usually how Ishvara is understood, not so much in yoga, doesn't get into that discussion, but Nyaya, other traditions get into that discussion. What is this Ishvara? Philosophically. Ishvara is a philosophical category, and then Ishvara is a theological category. Ishvara as a philosophical category is the intelligence behind the universe. There must be intelligence, and that position is still very much there. Of course, science sort of took a swing towards non-theism, but hopefully it will come back into some kind of a a more, here at Ruckus we have some good philosophers who are also philosophers who are also then defending a position of what we might call God or supreme of it, but they don't use the language of God. When you're a philosopher, you don't use the language of God. You use the language of intelligent design. Then if you go to church, you can use the language of God. So likewise in ancient India, if you're a philosopher, you use the language of Ishvara. And then when you go to your mandir, then you use the language of Bhagavan, Sri Krishna, Shiva, whatever it is that, but then you use the term Bhagavan, which is what, okay, that Ishvara, when that Ishvara manifests form, bhagas, form and qualities, then that becomes theology. If we want to use these categories, but which again, we have to be careful of doing it. We can use them initially just to make bridges, but we don't want to sort of, we shouldn't be using Western terms, my friends. Fair enough in Yogananda in 1920, fair enough, Vivekananda, 1893. But nowadays, we Westerners need to step out of our boxes and start learning Sanskrit terms, because our Western terms are why should we colonialize the Sanskrit language? I agree with that. We should start learning these terms now, but that's aside. So to wrap up, because I think my time might be running out. So Kriya Yoga, you never got to get a sense of Ishvara stealing butter, but no matter. We can leave that for another time. And that's a whole other. Okay, so therefore, what actions do we do in order to ready the mind so that it actually stands a chance of being able to nirodha, still itself? First, we have to tapaha. We have to sort of still the rajasic potentials, which we've been feeding in, according to Hinduism, for infinite births. So tapaha, there's a lot of tapaha to be done, but that's also very much assisted by importing. It's not just dry old, control, because that could be not very appealing. But we do svadhyaya, we study these sacred texts, which are very satisfying. And then, of course, Ishvara Pranidhana, which will mean so many different things to Krishna Bhaktas, Shiva Bhaktas. And of course, that becomes very joyful, as Krishna says in the Gita, Susukam. So not just stoic old drudgery of tapas, but that process is very much helped both by svadhyaya, but also by the basically Hinduism, if we want to generalize, on the street, is largely different forms of Ishvara Pranidhana, different forms of devotional activities to a very, very personal, in Ishvara's infinite forms. I'm writing a book on this now, because Western theology has resisted the idea that God has a form. And Hindu theologians will say, no. If God is omniscient, omnipotent, it has to be omni everything. How about omni beautiful? How about omni so many beautiful forms? So Hinduism, essentially, you have this infinity of omni for rupa, different forms, and Ishvara Pranidhana comes to mean that you get one of these forms, either culturally you accept your family tradition, or some form captures your heart, and then you engage in devotional practices such as offering pujas, such as mantras, such as kirtans, chanting, and reading the stories of these forms, and that has a purifying effect again on the mind, and makes the mind sattvic, and so these are the kriya. And I've only looked at the actions, and I've only looked at the first sutra. I've only discussed the first sutra of the second chapter, but hopefully gives you a little bit of a glimpse. So I want to just take a pause here and see how we're doing, and it's 6 o'clock, and see if we have any questions. I'm sorry if I was all over the place, but
that's fine, Professor.
You'll forgive me.
No, it's fine. There's so much to talk about, and you have a lot of knowledge to share with us. So, are there any questions? That might have been a lot for all of us to take in, but if anyone has any question, please ask. We can even unmute you. Students, I know you guys are, we didn't talk about all this stuff in class, but some of it certainly.
Srinivas,
Yes. Oh, yes, Jerry. Hello. Yes, sir.
I'd like to, Dr. Bryant mentioned about how so many of the words and ideas and concepts and practices from India have seeped into American society. And I think that's a very good point. I just want to point out there was a book, a speaker here a few years ago, Phil Goldberg, who wrote American Veda. And I just want to recommend it to your students for, it's really a very readable and very interesting book. And it captures this idea that Dr. Bryant just mentioned on briefly. And the subtitle is How Indian Spirituality Changed the West.
Yeah.
From Emerson and the Beatles,
Sure.
yoga and meditation.
Thank you. When I'm teaching a course right now called Western Encounter with Hinduism, which by the way is on my website, and it's, anyone can download it. And so there were 4 books that I chose for that. And the 4th one was precisely on this period, starting with Vivekananda up to the present. And that was, I sort of narrowed it down to the book you just showed us, American Veda, and a couple of others. And I went with Jeffrey Lung's American Hinduism. I had to make a call, and I know Jeffrey, and he's a scholar at a university here. And I took advice on it. I actually haven't read American Veda, but I was told it was a little bit journalistic in style, because it's not written by a scholar, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But I decided to go with Jeffrey Lung. But yes, thank you for that, for sharing that.
Yeah. Goldberg is a journalist.
He's a journalist, yeah, which
That's
is fine, which is great. But
Yeah.
obviously, in a university, then
Yeah.
we tend to prioritize books by scholars, rightly or wrongly. That's what we tend to do. So maybe in the next time I teach the course, we'll try the American Veda. Thank you. Yeah, I met him once, actually, very briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, he was here and
Okay.
gave several talks, some in Providence with Swami Yogatmananda, who's here today, I believe,
Yeah, I saw that.
and also here at UMass. He's been here twice at UMass.
That's great, and I really I really encourage, and I'm really happy to see that there are these rigid divisions between scholars and practitioners. And obviously a university is not an ashram, and obviously there has to be a certain level of intellectual expectations. But I'm glad to see it seems more acceptable now than when I was a student 25 years ago. It seems more acceptable to be bringing in this sort of variety of voices, including practitioner voices, and I'm all for that.
Yeah.
Personally, I've been a practitioner of for 45 years. So when I was a young student, I would never have disclosed that. And even as a young scholar, I would never disclose that, because I feared that I would be, somehow branded as somehow not objective. But now it's much more acceptable for scholars who are practitioners to just be upfront about it, because after all, everybody has a belief system. Why should only a practitioner's belief system be somehow brought into under scrutiny? Everyone, we can't navigate this world without some kind of a compass. So anyway, it's nice, and I see from your program there that you are you're open to this and encouraging of this, and I just want to honor that. Yeah.
Thank you. No, I think you brought up an incredibly important issue in academia generally. But Professor Sengupta had a question. Would you like to ask it, sir?
Thank you, Professor Bryant. My question is, what is the role of divine grace in this practice? Because some people claim to say that this is very scientific, if you follow step 1, 2, 3, and 4, you will end up with this higher state of samadhi or whatever.
Yeah, I think the Ishvara element gets it. Folks try to excise it. Patanjali is clearly a theist. He accepts Ishvara. Ishvara is the supremely omniscient. Tasya sarvajna niratishayam. He's the guru, purvesham guruhu. He's the guru of the ancients. He's klesha. He's beyond kleshas, beyond karma. So he's not he was never affected by klesha and karma. So he's not some yogi that attained enlightenment like some scholars. It's very interesting how scholars who should know better try to are uncomfortable with this Ishvara element in Patanjali, try to secularize it or to say that Ishvara is just some paradigmatic yogi and so much. And I have written on this. Ishvara for Patanjali is Ishvara. We have to see what Ishvara meant in the context in the 3rd century. It meant the creator God. Ishvara is Ish means to have power. So Ishvara is the person with the most power. What's the most powerful thing you can do? Creating. Ishvara is accepted in Nyaya or Vedanta by everybody as what we might call God. Now, to your question, in the chapter 2, there is one verse that says, Ishvara pranidana samadhi siddhir. Ishvara can bestow samadhi. 4 words, but certainly all the commentators take that as grace. That's a possibility. But what's interesting about Patanjali is that when he talks about, well, what do you fix your mind on? And he clearly prioritizes Ishvara. He puts it in the beginning of the list of alambanas. Alambana is the thing you fix your mind on. And so he has 6 or 7 verses, and he says, and we know that in Indian literature, the first thing, elements of a list are more important than second or third. So he talks about Ishvara, and then he says, Tasya vachika pranavaha, that he comes as the sound Om, and to japa tadartha bhavanam, you do japa on that. So that's resonating with the Upanishads and with the sort of larger Indian tradition that Ishvara comes as Om, you fix your mind on Om, and so that one can attain Nirodha by that. And then in chapter 2, he says, and Ishvara can just bestow that, which clearly is bhakti. And clearly, that resonates with, for example, Gita, where Krishna says, I can give you, I can give you, I can give you this. So that gets underplayed. And the reason I think that gets that gets sort of underplayed is because I think Western scholars, first of all, they want to make it secular and and they don't know what to do with, with this Ishvara element. But what are you going to do with the whole of chapter 3 and all the siddhis? And the whole thing. So, so people become very selective in that regard. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, after all, I think it's benevolent if meditation spreads. I mean, the sutras are always going to be the sutras. There's always going to be people like me and perhaps like you who are going to say, well, hang on a minute, let's have a look at what it really says. But there is this grace, absolutely. And it doesn't get elaborated upon in Patanjali. Obviously, it does in the Gita much more richly. The traditional commentators never saw any distinction. They clearly understood the Ishvara of Patanjali to be the same Ishvara that is in the Gita, and that is, also, in other texts. So it's really, so grace is there. It's just that Patanjali doesn't elaborate on it, but he does mention it. Remember, these are sutras, they're very cryptic. And, he's only talking about yoga. There's only 1,200 words. It's a tiny, tiny text. You know what 1,200 words is? It's 2 pages, 12 font, double spaced. So he's not going to be bringing in all this additional information. His project, he announces it right in the first verse, Atta Yoga Anushasana. Fully aware, because he's prioritizing Svadhyaya, fully aware that bhakti is much more richly developed in, the Gita, the Puranas, and this other vast corpus of material and the Itihasa. So but it's there. It's definitely there. Grace is there, and certainly understood that way by the commentators.
Dr. Singh, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I have a question, and just to give Dr. Bryant a little bit of background, this is the course that I developed when I was at the UMass. So I have a little bit of background in this. But my question is that where do you put Iswara and Brahm?
Well, Patanjali never mentions the word Brahman. Patanjali never mentions that word. He mentions the
I
term.
know, I know. That's why I'm asking this question. That when you were saying that Iswara is something has to be referring to faith and God or something. Actually, Patanjali never says that. He basically simply says, like you said, it is beyond the klesa and karmaphala, which
Yeah.
and when Bhagavan Krishna said Yogeshwara, there is a Ishvara in there, and that's related to yoga. And
Yeah.
by practicing yoga, you can go beyond klesa and karmaphala. So if you can, if like a scientific understanding, if it talks like a cat and walks like a cat, it must be a cat. So if you can reach by doing yoga, the beyond klesa and karmaphala, then you got to be Yushara, and that's what Patanjali is saying. So why are you bringing this something to do with faith and something to do with grace? I mean, the grace is something that is biological.
No, I didn't say faith. I'm referring to in the second chapter, Patanjali says, Ishvara Pranidanad Samadhi Siddh here. From Ishvara Pranidhana, you get the perfection of yoga. So the commentators there speak of grace. That Ishvara can bestow. What is that? So there's four words in that sutra. How do we understand what that means? So either we can try to construe our own meaning, or we follow the commentators. If we follow the commentators, they all take that to mean that Ishvara can bestow as an act of grace. So that's part of the commentarial tradition. Now, what Patanjali has in mind when he says Ishvara Pranidhana Samadhi Siddh here, that we'll never know. We choose to follow the commentators, or we can then come up with our own interpretation. That's up to us. So, and the other point you made is Ishvara is not like us, because Ishvara has never been affected by klesha and karma. And the commentators are very clear here. They say he's not like Kapila or the Buddha or other great yogis, because the Kapila and the Buddha, they were once affected by klesha and karma, and then they became the great Kapila. But Ishvara is not like that, because the verse says, klesha karma samaya anna vichinnaha, has never been affected by these things. And so they're clearly we're talking about a transcendent being. And also, tasya sarva jnanirati shayam, his omniscience is unsurpassed. He's not like the omniscience of some yogi who gets some siddhi. So we're talking about the Ishvara as is understood in the larger tradition, in the Gita, elsewhere. I think it's hard to deny that. And now, whether we want to take that Ishvara in a Dvaita Vedanta sense or in a Vishishta Dvaita or a Dvaita sense, that's a discussion for Vedanta that has nothing to do with yoga.
Well, I was just simply the reason I was asking about Brahma, because in Indian tradition, at least people are able to say Aham Brahmasmi.
Yeah.
I mean, God does not create, from Indian tradition, God does not create anybody. Actually, God is created by human beings. Human beings are supposed, or can at least achieve. I understand what you're saying, that people like us who cannot reach there, we obviously just leave it to the grace or whatever. But I think that's not the meaning of it. The meaning is that you can, if you work hard enough, you can get there. So that's something to be pursued rather than something to be left to the grace.
Sure. Could I just say that the position you're representing is the position of Advaita Vedanta, that of Shankara, that becomes it is not the position of a Ramanuja or a Madhva or a Vishnu Swami or a Vallabha or a Chaitanya. So we have to show some appreciation that the Ishwar is not a human construct for many Vedanta traditions. It is only Advaita Vedanta that this is Vyavaharika, that Ishwar is Vyavaharika and Paramartika is we're free of all of this. So we need to be a little bit more contextual in how we situate Ishwara. So certainly what you're saying fits very well with Advaita Vedanta and with that line of thinking from Advaita Vedanta into Vivekananda, into Neo-Advaita, no doubt. But it does not reflect the thinking of the Vaishnava and other types of traditions, such as some of the Vedantins that I named. So there are these differences in terms of how Ishvara is understood. And if the question is, how does Patanjali understand Ishvara? Well, we only have these 12 words. And so we have to, we have to sort of really, there's not much you can do with 12 words, which Patanjali dedicates to Ishvara.
So, Professor, we have one more question I think we can take. Balaji, would you like to ask it, please?
Namaskar, Balaji.
Thank you. Namaskar. Thank you for your talk, Professor Bryant. And I am actually reading this book, this one. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
So while you were talking, I was also referring to the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra in this book, which is a very brief introduction, but good for a person like me who doesn't know much. So my question is, how does one attain the highest attainment of liberation of the Purusha? Can it be done by studying Patanjali's text? Surely that would be simple. So do we need a higher intellect, practice controlling of desires, and how do we do that to do tapas? And so do we have to fall back on the age-old practice of needing a guru to guide us?
Well, the idea of giving up desire, there is every single moksha tradition in ancient India, other than perhaps with some qualification, left-handed tantra, but all of the Bauddha traditions, the Buddhist traditions, Jain traditions, Vedanta, Patanjali, Gita, we have to give up all desires, at least desires that are related to body, mind, seeking happiness through body, mind. If we cannot do that, we might be able to be pious, we might be able to make good karma, we might be able to get a good next birth, but we're not going to get the experience of that, of the Atman. So that desire is giving up desire is non-negotiable. If you read the Gita, 2nd chapter, Arjuna says, well, how do you recognize a real yogi? At the, verse 50, around the 50s, Krishna answers 20 verses, every single verse, give up desire, give up desire, give up desire. Patanjali calls it a klesha that needs to be given up. So that is it's non-negotiable. If we can't do that, then the next best option is, well, at least be dharmic, at least do punya. Patanjali says punya, then you get good ilhada, you get a good jati ayubhoga, you get a good next birth. And most in ancient India, remember the yogis are a fraction of the population. And the vast majority of people in ancient India, as in any culture, in any time, they are doing dharma. They're doing their Vedika sacrifices, they're doing their dharma, and they're trying to make punya, and they're trying to make a good next birth. So if we find it too daunting, the idea of giving up all desires, then the next best thing is, well, at least try to make our desires a little sattvic, a little bit less, a little more benevolent, and a little more, so both for ourselves, our own future births, and also for other living beings. So the next option then is to be dharmic, so otherwise, but we can also chip away at it, and yes, studying, and doing Ishvara Pranidhana practices like pujas, and studying Patanjali, Vedanta, Upanishads. Surely, clearly that changes our mind, because remember, when we study, all of those words they become samskaras in our mind. Our mind is nothing other than a net. It's nothing other than a container of samskaras. So depending on what we put in it, that becomes our mind. So the more we study, even if we're householders, we got our families, we got our children, but if we have some interest in yoga, we have some interest in moksha, then study puja is a very, very excellent way of slowly changing the nature of the mind, along with some tapas, some doable tapas. Everybody starts wherever they are and does a little bit of tapas, nothing too drastic that's going to cause frustration and so forth. And maybe and Krishna says in the Gita, maybe it takes many births. No problem. Let it take many births. What else are we going to do? Once we start getting this jnana, everything else becomes a little bit foolish. Any other goal starts to become temporary and really a little bit unsatisfying and non-meaningful. So chip away, little. Svadhyaya is a great place to start. And of course,
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a little puja practice. Keep that going. And all of this is part of the spiritual journey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's a perfect place to end. Let's all thank Professor Bryant. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for your for the invitation. Yes, and sounds like a wonderful course. I wish I could take it. Your course on Kriya Yoga.
You're welcome anytime. And well, I think there were a lot of profound ideas discussed, and we have a lot of food for thought for sure. But like you said, little by little, we all try to do our best and live a dharmic life.
Right.
So
Yes.
thank you, everyone. Thank you. This is the last talk of this semester, but we'll be in touch about future events. And please take care. Thank you again, Professor Bryant, for spending this time with us and setting aside some of your precious time to discuss these important, beautiful philosophies of India. So thank you, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste. Namaskar.